There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot cure, an exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body, nor with a lack of rest. A quieter, deeper exhaustion that appears when your daily actions slowly begin to drift away from who you truly are. And the problem is that this exhaustion does not come from a sudden event. It settles in gradually, so slowly that most people end up believing it is normal. They continue to live, to move forward, to function, without realizing that inside, something is slowly disconnecting. And according to certain traditions, it is precisely this gap between what you do and what you are meant to be. This is what is called Dharma. Until the day you realize that you have not really lived your life, you have simply strung together days in survival mode. And at that moment, one question becomes impossible to ignore. How could I have drifted so far away from my Dharma without ever realizing it? Most people think that fatigue is something that can be cured with rest. They believe that a good night's sleep, a few days of vacation, or a quiet weekend will be enough to restore their energy. Yet there is another form of fatigue, a much quieter and much deeper fatigue, a fatigue that does not disappear when we close our eyes and is still waiting for us when we wake up. It is a fatigue that does not come from the body, but from the gap between the life we are living and the life we feel we are meant to live. Many people get up every morning, complete their tasks, fulfill their responsibilities, and pursue their goals without ever stopping to ask themselves why they do what they do. They move forward because they have always moved forward. They follow paths they set out on years ago without ever checking whether those paths are actually leading them where they truly want to go. Over time, this way of living becomes normal. Habits take the place of choices, routine takes the place of reflection, and days begin to resemble one another to the point where weeks, months, and sometimes even years seem to disappear without leaving a trace. It is then that a strange feeling appears, one that many people struggle to explain. Nothing is really wrong, yet nothing seems completely right. There is not necessarily a catastrophe, no obvious drama, no spectacular failure, and yet there is still a vague sense of dissatisfaction, as if something essential were missing without being able to say exactly what it is, as if a part of oneself had been left behind somewhere along the way. This feeling is particularly confusing because it can appear even when everything seems to be going well. A person may have a job, friends, a certain level of stability, and still feel a void that is difficult to name. This emptiness is often interpreted as a lack of motivation, a lack of gratitude, or simply a temporary slump, but it is sometimes the sign of something much deeper. It can be a sign that we have spent so much time responding to the expectations of the outside world that we have stopped listening to what is happening within us. Since childhood, we receive thousands of messages about what it means to succeed in life. We are told what to study, what to avoid, what to desire, what to accomplish, and even what to consider important. Little by little, these ideas become our own, without us realizing that they often come from somewhere else. We learn to pursue certain goals because they are socially valued. We learn to admire certain forms of success because they are visible. We learn to compare our progress to that of others as if life were a constant competition. The problem is that this constant comparison sometimes distances us from ourselves. By focusing on what others possess, we forget to ask ourselves what we truly want. By trying so hard to become someone, we forget to understand who we are. And when that distance becomes too great, a particular kind of fatigue begins to appear. It is not a fatigue caused by effort, but a fatigue caused by misalignment. The misalignment between our actions and our values, between our deepest desires and our daily behaviors, between the person we show to the world and the person we encounter when we are alone with our thoughts. This misalignment works slowly. It does not destroy a life in a single day. It settles in gradually, almost invisibly. That is what makes it so dangerous. Many people do not realize that they are drifting away from themselves because this process is extremely slow. They continue to move forward, to work, to accomplish what is expected of them, all while feeling a weariness they do not understand. So they look for quick solutions. They think they need more distractions, more stimulation, more novelty. They fill their free time with content, noise, activities, and entertainment. But as soon as the silence returns, the question is still there. That question that so many people avoid because it is uncomfortable. Am I truly living a life that reflects who I really am? It is a difficult question because it is not about what we have, but about who we are. It does not ask how much we earn, how much we own, or how many people admire us. It asks whether our choices are genuinely our own. And this question becomes even more important in a world where everything seems designed to capture our attention. We spend so much time exposed to the expectations, opinions, and achievements of others that it sometimes becomes difficult to hear our own inner voice. We know what others think. We know what others want. We know what others value. But we no longer always know what we truly feel. That is why some people experience existential crises even when their lives seem objectively successful. They discover that the real problem was not the absence of success, but the absence of connection with themselves. They realize that it is possible to win a game that they never truly chose to play. And that realization is often the beginning of a profound transformation. The most important consequences of our choices are almost never visible immediately. That is what makes them so difficult to recognize. When a person makes a poor financial decision, the effects may appear quickly. When a person neglects their health, the body often ends up sending clear signals. But when a person gradually drifts away from who they truly are, the consequences follow a different logic. They advance slowly, silently, almost invisibly. At first, nothing dramatic happens. Life goes on. The days unfold normally. Responsibilities are fulfilled. Goals are pursued. Everything seems to be working. Yet something has already begun to change beneath the surface. A slight loss of enthusiasm appears. The things that once brought satisfaction seem less intense. Victories bring less joy than before. Achievements quickly become ordinary. And little by little, a strange feeling settles in. The feeling of being physically present in one's own life while being emotionally absent. Many people live in this state for years without giving it a name. They keep moving forward because they think this is simply what being an adult means. They believe everyone feels the same way. They regard their inner weariness as normal. But what seems normal when experienced every day can sometimes be the sign of a deep imbalance. When a human being acts for a long time in contradiction with what they deeply feel, they often develop a form of detachment. This detachment does not resemble sadness. It is more like a gradual loss of intensity. Emotions become less vivid, dreams become less important, curiosity fades, mental energy weakens. The person slowly stops exploring, imagining, or questioning their path. They begin to function more than they truly live. And this is one of the most dangerous consequences: the slow transformation of a living individual into a mere executor of their own routine. This process is rarely noticed because it unfolds over many years. No one wakes up one morning and tells themselves they have lost touch with who they are. On the contrary, it feels like an accumulation of small renunciations. Giving up a desire because it seems unrealistic. Giving up a passion because it appears useless. Giving up an idea because it might be judged. Giving up a part of oneself in exchange for approval, security, or stability. Each of these decisions seems insignificant when taken individually. But over time, they end up building an entire life. A life that may appear perfectly reasonable from the outside, yet leaves a strange feeling of incompleteness on the inside. One of the most subtle consequences of this situation is the loss of presence. Many people no longer truly live in the present moment. They are constantly projected into the future or trapped in the past. They wait for the next promotion, the next purchase, the next opportunity, the next milestone. They live with the idea that satisfaction is always a little farther ahead. Yet when they finally achieve what they were pursuing, the expected feeling often lasts only a few days, sometimes only a few hours. Then a new goal appears, and the cycle begins again. This endless pursuit creates the illusion of movement. We feel as though we are progressing, when in reality we may simply be circling around the same unresolved questions. As time passes, this mechanism can generate significant psychological fatigue. The human brain is not designed to endlessly chase rewards that lack deep meaning. It needs to feel that its efforts are connected to something that truly matters. When it cannot find that connection, a sense of emptiness begins to emerge. This emptiness often pushes individuals to seek compensation. Some take refuge in excessive work, others in consumption, others still in constant entertainment. They fill every free minute in order to avoid silence. Because silence has a unique property, it reveals what noise conceals. When there is nothing left to distract the mind, the questions return, the doubts return. Long-ignored feelings rise back to the surface. This is why so many people struggle to remain alone with their thoughts. It is not loneliness that frightens them. It is what they might discover about themselves. Another hidden consequence appears in the relationship we have with time. When we live in alignment with what is meaningful to us, time seems to possess a certain richness. Experiences leave memories. Days have a distinct texture. Conversely, when we live mostly on autopilot, years can seem to disappear at an alarming speed. Many people have experienced this feeling, looking back and wondering where the last 5 or 10 years went. This sensation is not only related to age, it is often linked to a lack of conscious presence in our own lives. The more repetitive a period is, and the more disconnected it is from our deepest aspirations, the less our brain distinguishes it from other periods. Days blend into one another until it feels as though a portion of time has evaporated. But perhaps the deepest consequence is the one that affects our identity. When a person spends too long responding to external expectations without listening to their own inner needs, they sometimes lose something essential: self-knowledge. They know what others expect from them. They know what role they are supposed to play. They know how to be perceived. But when they find themselves alone facing a simple question such as, "What do you truly want?" they struggle to answer. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they have spent so much time looking outward that they have forgotten how to look inward. And perhaps that is the most important hidden consequence of all. Gradually losing touch with the person one could have become. Because every choice we make builds one version of our future while closing off other possibilities. When we live for a long time without awareness of our deepest motivations, we risk building an entire existence around goals that do not truly belong to us. What is most unsettling is that this phenomenon can remain invisible for a very long time. It does not necessarily trigger an immediate crisis. Instead, it tends to appear in the form of a persistent question that arises during quiet moments. Why do I feel that something is missing when I have everything I thought I wanted? And when that question appears, it often marks the beginning of a change. Because from the moment a person begins to see the invisible consequences of their choices, it becomes much more difficult to continue living unconsciously. What was once merely a feeling becomes an awakening, and every awakening possesses a unique power, the power to make a complete return to ignorance impossible. Human behavior is almost never as free as it appears. We like to believe that our decisions are the result of rational thinking, conscious choice, and perfectly controlled personal will. Yet a large part of what we do every day is influenced by invisible psychological mechanisms operating in the background without our full awareness. The human brain is, above all, an organ of adaptation, designed to conserve mental energy and reduce uncertainty. This means it naturally prefers what is familiar over what is true, what is known over what is uncertain, and what is comfortable over what is potentially transformative. This is why many behaviors repeat automatically, even when they do not produce genuine satisfaction. A person may know that a habit brings nothing positive to their life and still continue to repeat it. Not because they lack intelligence or willpower, but because their brain has associated that habit with a form of psychological safety. What is familiar, even when unsatisfying, is often perceived as less dangerous than what is unknown, even when promising. This mechanism explains why it is so difficult to change direction in life, even when we deeply feel that something is wrong. Change requires breaking away from established patterns, and that break is interpreted by the brain as a potential risk. As a result, remaining in an uncomfortable but familiar situation can feel more acceptable than exploring a new and uncertain path. Another essential factor in human behavior is the constant search for social validation. Since the earliest days of humanity, belonging to a group has been synonymous with survival. To be accepted meant to be protected. To be rejected meant to be vulnerable. Although our modern environment has changed, this biological mechanism remains deeply rooted in our psychological functioning. This is why we place so much importance on the opinions of others, their judgments, and their approval. Many of the decisions we make are not based solely on what we truly want, but on what we believe will be accepted, valued, or respected by those around us. Gradually, this can create a subtle gap between our true identity and our social identity. We begin to act not according to what we genuinely feel, but according to what we think we are supposed to be. And the larger this gap becomes, the more difficult it is to distinguish our authentic desires from those we have unconsciously absorbed through our social environment. This phenomenon is often reinforced by constant comparison. In the modern era, we are continuously exposed to the achievements, lifestyles, and appearances of others. This exposure creates an implicit reference point that influences how we perceive ourselves. We no longer evaluate ourselves solely according to our personal progress, but according to what we see in others. The problem is that this comparison is never neutral. It often pushes us to desire what is visible, impressive, or socially valued, rather than what is genuinely aligned with our inner nature. As a result, we may find ourselves pursuing goals that do not originate from us, but from an unconscious imitation of external models. The human brain also operates according to a principle of internal consistency. When a person repeatedly adopts a behavior, that behavior eventually begins to influence their perceived identity. In other words, we do not merely do what we think we are. We also become what we repeatedly do. This means that small daily actions, even those that seem insignificant, gradually shape the way we see ourselves. If a person constantly avoids difficult decisions, they may gradually perceive themselves as someone lacking courage, even if this is not inherently true. Conversely, when they consistently act in alignment with their deepest values, they develop a stronger and more coherent sense of identity. This mechanism explains why personal change depends not only on major decisions, but above all, on the repetition of consistent micro-behaviors. Another fundamental aspect of human psychology is the management of emotional discomfort. The brain naturally seeks to avoid unpleasant internal states such as anxiety, uncertainty, or frustration. To achieve this, it develops avoidance strategies that can take many forms: distraction, procrastination, rationalization, or even excessive busyness. These behaviors are not necessarily signs of weakness, but protective mechanisms. However, when they become automatic, they can prevent a person from confronting important truths about themselves or their situation. As a result, many decisions are not made to move toward what is good, but rather to move away from what is uncomfortable. This avoidance-based logic can gradually distance a person from their deepest aspirations, because what is truly meaningful often requires passing through a certain degree of initial discomfort. Finally, there is a central paradox in the psychology of human behavior. We want to change, but we also want to remain safe. And these two forces often come into conflict. The desire for transformation requires leaving familiar territory, while the need for security encourages us to remain within what is known. This internal conflict explains why so many people feel tension between who they wish to become and what they are actually able to do. Understanding these mechanisms does not eliminate them, but it allows us to observe them differently. And sometimes, that simple awareness is already the first step toward a deeper transformation. Not because behavior changes immediately, but because the person finally begins to see what had been operating unnoticed all along. The central paradox of human existence is that most of the things we pursue in order to feel better are precisely the things that move us away from what we are truly seeking. We chase comfort, yet it is often prolonged comfort that gives rise to discomfort. We seek security, yet that very security can eventually become a form of invisible prison. We want to avoid pain, uncertainty, and doubt, and yet these very states often accompany the most profound periods of transformation in a human life. What makes this paradox even more complex is that it does not manifest itself in an obvious way. It does not appear as a clear contradiction that can be easily resolved. It hides within our daily choices, within the small decisions we make without much thought, within the habits we maintain because they seem logical in the short term but often produce the opposite effect in the long term. For example, avoiding emotional discomfort may provide immediate relief, but it can strengthen that very discomfort over time. Postponing a difficult action may reduce anxiety in the moment but increase future stress. Remaining in a familiar situation may offer apparent stability while sustaining a silent dissatisfaction. Thus, what we perceive as short-term solutions often become long-term problems. This is where the paradox becomes particularly unsettling. Our brains are optimized to survive in the present moment, not necessarily to build a coherent life over the long term. They prioritize whatever reduces immediate tension, even if it sustains a deeper tension over time. This explains why some people can remain trapped for years in patterns they know are ineffective. It is not that they lack awareness. They lack distance from their own internal mechanisms. Another aspect of this paradox is that the more a person seeks to perfectly control their life, the more frustration they may experience when that control fails. The need for total control often conflicts with the unpredictable nature of existence, and the greater this tension becomes, the more the individual may intensify their efforts to control everything, creating a cycle in which the pursuit of stability generates even greater inner instability. Conversely, some of the most profound transformations often occur when this need for control softens slightly, allowing for a more flexible adaptation to reality. There is also a paradox in our relationship with happiness. We tend to believe that happiness is a final state to be achieved, a kind of stable destination where problems disappear and everything becomes coherent. Yet when happiness is pursued as a fixed objective, it paradoxically becomes more difficult to attain. The more directly we try to be happy, the more aware we become of what is not right, which paradoxically increases feelings of dissatisfaction. As a result, happiness does not seem to function as a direct goal, but rather as a byproduct of a certain alignment between our actions, our values, and our perception of the world. This paradox also extends to the idea of personal change. Many people believe that in order to change, they must force themselves intensely, fight against themselves, and impose rigid, constant discipline. But this approach can sometimes generate even stronger internal resistance because it transforms change into a permanent battle against oneself. In many cases, lasting transformation appears not only through force, but also through a process of understanding and gradual adjustment. The more a person understands their own mechanisms, the less they need to violently constrain themselves in order to evolve. Finally, the deepest paradox may lie in our relationship with ourselves. We often strive to become an ideal version of ourselves, a version that is more accomplished, more disciplined, more productive, more stable. But in this pursuit, we can sometimes drift away from understanding who we truly are in the present moment. We chase a future image without fully integrating our current reality. And it is precisely this gap between what we want to become and what we are that can generate a constant inner tension. Thus, the fundamental paradox may be this: the more we try to escape who we are today, the more difficult it becomes to build a version of ourselves that is authentic and stable tomorrow. A new perspective often appears not as a complete answer, but as a subtle shift in the way we look at a problem. What once seemed confusing, heavy, or incomprehensible begins to take on a different shape when we slightly change our angle of observation. In the case of human behavior, inner emptiness, and the existential fatigue that many people experience without being able to name it, another interpretation becomes possible. What if the problem is not simply what we do with our lives, but the way we have learned to relate to what we feel? What if for a long time, we have developed an invisible habit of ignoring internal signals in favor of external expectations? This idea profoundly changes our understanding of modern discomfort because it shifts the source of the problem from the external world to the inner world. It is no longer solely a question of circumstances, success, or failure, but a question of alignment between what we are living and what we perceive about ourselves. From this perspective, many experiences begin to take on a different meaning. Inner emptiness is no longer merely a flaw to be corrected, but a signal to be interpreted. Persistent dissatisfaction is no longer simply a personal failure, but perhaps a silent form of communication between our actions and our deeper identity. This perspective does not seek to romanticize suffering or make it necessary. Rather, it places it within a broader framework where it becomes understandable. For what is misunderstood is often amplified, while what is understood can gradually be transformed. Another way of looking at things is to recognize that the human brain does not primarily seek truth. It seeks coherence. It prefers a stable narrative, even an imperfect one, to a fragmented reality that is difficult to interpret. This is why we construct stories about ourselves, our choices, and our identity. These stories help us make sense of our experience, but they can also trap us within limited interpretations. When these narratives become too rigid, they can prevent questioning that is necessary for any meaningful evolution. The new perspective, then, is to stop viewing our thoughts as absolute truths and instead see them as evolving mental constructions. This creates a different inner space, one in which it becomes possible to observe our own mechanisms without completely identifying with them. Within this framework, emotions, doubts, and internal contradictions are no longer enemies to eliminate, but information to understand. Discomfort becomes an indicator rather than a verdict. This approach also transforms the way we interpret change. Instead of seeing it as a brutal break from the past, it can be understood as a series of gradual adjustments in the way we understand ourselves. In this sense, personal transformation does not rely solely on the desire to become someone else, but on the ability to recognize what within us needs to be realigned. In this way, the very notion of a problem begins to change. What we once called a flaw may be understood as information that has been misinterpreted. What we once called failure may be seen as an incomplete attempt at adaptation. And what we once called emptiness may be perceived as a lack of coherence between different parts of our inner life. This new perspective does not eliminate difficulties, but it changes the relationship we have with them. It allows us to move from a logic of fighting against ourselves to a logic of observation and understanding. And within this subtle shift, something essential happens. The person gradually stops seeing themselves as a problem to be solved and begins to see themselves as a system to be understood. If we carry this reflection to its conclusion, one final question always seems to emerge. A question that appears simple on the surface, but becomes deeply uncomfortable when we truly take the time to consider it. Because beyond theories, analyses, and psychological explanations, there is always the reality of a life lived day by day, made up of repeated choices, established habits, and directions taken without always being aware of where they originated. And within this constant flow of days that seem to resemble one another, it becomes easy to lose sight of what matters most. Not what we are capable of accomplishing, but what we choose to repeat every day without thinking about it. This is where the question gains its full power, because it does not demand an immediate answer, nor an intellectual justification, but rather an inner honesty that is difficult to avoid. If you continue on exactly the same trajectory, with the same habits, the same priorities, the same distractions, and the same daily decisions, does the life you are building today truly resemble the one you would want to inhabit a few years from now? And more importantly, will the person you become be aligned with the person you are meant to be according to your own standards, rather than those you have inherited or adopted without reflection? This question is uncomfortable because it does not allow the possibility of remaining neutral. It forces you to observe the direction, not merely the movement. It compels you to recognize that time does not simply pass. It quietly builds something from whatever we repeatedly do. And what we repeat always ends up becoming more important than what we occasionally think. That is why this reflection is not only about the major decisions in life, but above all about the small, invisible decisions that, accumulated over time, define an entire trajectory. The real difficulty, therefore, is not determining what should be changed in a dramatic way, but recognizing what we continue to allow to remain unchanged day after day. Because at its core, most major transformations do not begin with an extraordinary event. but with a quiet realization of something that can no longer be ignored. And it is precisely at this point that the question becomes essential, almost unavoidable. If nothing changes in the way you think, choose, and act, then is the life you are currently building truly worthy of being lived by the person you will become? If this video has led you to ask yourself even a single new question about your own life, then it has already done its job, because the goal is not to give you a perfect answer, but to encourage you to observe what you have been doing until now without ever truly questioning it. Most people watch this kind of content, feel something for a few seconds, and then return to exactly the same habits as before. But if you are still here, at this very moment, perhaps something within you has not simply listened, but has genuinely begun to reflect. And if that is the case, I would like to ask you one simple but important thing. Write the word consciousness in the comments if you watched this video until the end. Not for me, but for yourself, as a quiet proof that you did not simply consume this reflection, but that you truly went through it. And if you want to continue this journey of reflection, subscribe, because the next videos will go even deeper into understanding human psychology, invisible behaviors, and the forces that truly influence our lives without us even realizing it.